The floor was dark by then, every desk empty, every monitor off except the one lamp burning between us. Her face was still red, streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away, and her hand was shaking inside mine. I asked her the only question that mattered that night. Why do you stay behind every night? She looked at me for a long moment before she answered, and when she finally spoke, the tears came harder. My coworker stayed behind after everyone left. Then she finally told me why. I still feel that ache in my chest when I think about it now. My name is Ezra Caldwell. I am 34 years old, a structural engineer at a firm called Ashgate in Denver, Colorado. And for a long time, I thought I knew exactly who I was. 14 months before that night, my marriage of 6 years ended. There were no children involved, no long custody battles, no house to fight over in court. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it harder. My ex-wife, Vanessa, was 2 years younger than me, and by the time we signed the papers, we had simply stopped looking at each other the way people are supposed to. We didn't hate each other. We just weren't the same two people who had walked into that marriage 6 years earlier, and neither of us knew how to say that out loud until it was almost too late to matter. After the divorce, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes from downtown. It had good light in the mornings, and almost nothing else. I told myself I liked the quiet. I told myself a lot of things that first year. The truth was simpler than I wanted to admit. The apartment felt like a waiting room, like a place I was passing through rather than living in, and I found that I could not sit in it for very long without my mind wandering somewhere I did not want to go. So I stopped trying. I started staying at the office instead. Ashgate occupied the 11th and 12th floors of a glass building downtown. Structural engineers and drafters working alongside architects on projects that stretched across half the state. I had worked there for almost 9 years by then, long enough to know the particular sound the building made after 6 in the evening, the way the air conditioning cycled down, the way the laser printer in the corner room hummed and clicked when nobody had touched it in an hour, the way my own coffee, made fresh at 2 in the afternoon, would go cold and bitter by 8 without me ever noticing I hadn't finished it. I told myself I stayed late because the work demanded it. Some nights that was even true. Other nights I just didn't want to go home to a kitchen with one plate in the drying rack and a couch that still smelled faintly like nothing at all. Because nothing had happened there in months. I want to say I was doing fine. I want to say the first year after Vanessa was some kind of quiet triumph. A man rebuilding himself brick by brick. It wasn't that clean. Mostly it was just repetition waking up. Driving in while the sky over the front range was still the color of a bruise. Working until the building emptied out around me, and driving home when there was nothing left to check twice. I had colleagues who cared about me, people who asked if I was doing all right and meant it, and I gave them the same answer every time. Fine. Getting there. I wasn't lying exactly. I just didn't have a better word for the specific kind of tired that comes from missing something you're not sure you even wanted back. What I didn't expect, in the middle of all that repetition, was that I would stop being the last person in the office. I noticed it before I understood it, the way you notice a change in weather before you can name what's different about the air. For months, the 11th floor after 7 in the evening had belonged entirely to me. And then, without any announcement, without anything I could point to and say this is when it started, it didn't anymore. There was a light still on at the far end of the drafting bay. There was a second set of footsteps on the stairs when I finally decided to call it a night. I didn't think much of it at first. Deadlines do that to a firm. They pull people in odd directions, keep them at their desks past reasonable hours, make ghosts of the whole building for a season, and then let it go quiet again. I assumed this was that. I assumed it would pass. It didn't pass. And by the time I understood why, everything about that year had already quietly rearranged itself around a person I hadn't expected to matter this much. Her name was Harper Delaney. She was 30 years old, a drafter who had spent her first 2 years at Ashgate on the 12th floor, working under a different team lead, and one afternoon in early spring she transferred down to mine. The official reason, the one she gave to our department head, and the one she gave to me when I asked, was straightforward enough. She wanted to learn structural detailing from someone who had spent almost a decade doing it, and I was apparently that someone. I remember thinking it was a reasonable request and not thinking about it again. I had no idea, not even the faintest suspicion, that there was a second reason sitting quietly behind the first one. A reason she had been carrying for 2 years already by the time she asked for that transfer. A reason that had nothing to do with structural detailing at all. It started small, the way these things tend to. A week or two after she joined the team, I noticed she was still at her desk when I walked out most evenings. I didn't think anything of it. New people often overcorrect, staying later than necessary to prove themselves, and I assumed that was what this was. Then one morning I came in and found a small square of yellow paper stuck to the corner of my monitor. It said, in handwriting I didn't recognize yet, "Checked your load calcs on the Ridgeline job numbers look clean. Nice work." Underneath it, instead of a signature, someone had drawn a tiny sun, just a circle with a few short lines radiating out from it, the kind of doodle a person makes without thinking, an old habit worn smooth by repetition. I peeled it off and set it beside my keyboard, and I didn't think about it again until the next morning, when there was another one, and the morning after that, and the one after that. They weren't always about work. Some of them were a correction on a beam span I'd misread, a reminder about a client call I'd have otherwise forgotten, a note that the plotter on the 12th floor was jammed again, and not worth the walk. But some of them were just small kindnesses with nowhere else to go. Saw you skip lunch again. There's a granola bar in the second drawer if you want it. That storm last night looked like it might have kept you up too. Hope you got some sleep anyway. Nothing large. Nothing that asked for anything back. Just a small yellow square and a small yellow sun, appearing on my monitor almost every morning, like something the building itself had decided to do for me. I asked around, carefully, the way a person asks about something they don't want to seem too interested in. Nobody claimed it. A few people teased me about having a secret admirer, and I laughed it off the way you laugh off things you've decided not to take seriously, because taking it seriously would have meant admitting how much I looked forward to peeling that little square off the screen each morning. I told myself it didn't matter who it was. I told myself a lot of things that spring. What I did notice, because it was harder to miss, was Harper. She had a quiet way of working that I found myself drawn to without meaning to. She asked good questions. The kind that told you she'd already thought hard about the problem before she brought it to you, and she listened to the answers instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. She stayed late most nights, always with some version of the same explanation. Just cleaning up the Denver Tower drawings before tomorrow. Almost done. I believed her every time, because it was true every time. It just wasn't the whole truth, and I had no way of knowing that yet. The Denver Tower project made all of this easier to explain away, and harder to see clearly. It was the largest job Ashgate had taken on in years, a 32-story mixed-use tower going up 6 blocks from our offices, and the schedule was brutal from the start. Structural reviews that should have taken a week got compressed into 2 days. I was pulling load documents at 9 at night more often than I'd like to admit, and more often than not, Harper was 2 desks over doing the same thing, her desk lamp the only other light left on that side of the floor. We fell into a rhythm without either of us deciding to. She would bring 2 coffees back from the shop downstairs instead of 1, setting the second cup on my desk without a word, already knowing by then that I took it black and that I wouldn't say much beyond a quiet thank you. I would proofread her drawings before submittal, even when it wasn't technically my job, because she asked, and because I had started to like the particular quiet of doing careful work beside someone else who cared about doing it well. There is a kind of trust that builds itself in small increments, so slowly you don't notice the moment it became solid. That's what those months were. Neither of us said much about anything outside the work. We didn't talk about my divorce. Not directly, though I think she understood the shape of it from the way I flinched at certain questions other people asked without thinking. We didn't talk about whatever had brought her down to my team either, beyond the explanation she'd already given. But we talked about everything else, the buildings we'd both admired walking through downtown as kids, the particular stubbornness of a beam that refused to check out no matter how many times we ran the numbers, the way the light hit the Rockies from the 12th floor windows on a clear evening, in a way that made the whole ugly, exhausting year feel briefly worth it. The notes kept coming. I stopped trying to solve the mystery of them, mostly because some part of me had started to enjoy not knowing, the way you enjoy a story more when you haven't skipped ahead to the ending. I began looking forward to that yellow square before I even admitted to myself that I was looking forward to it. Some mornings, if I got in before it appeared, I found myself glancing at my monitor every few minutes and telling myself it was nothing. Looking back now, I can see exactly what I couldn't see then. Harper had transferred to my team for a real reason. She genuinely wanted to learn from me, and I taught her plenty that spring, patiently, the way someone had once been patient with me. But underneath that true reason sat another one, older and quieter. One she had been carrying since a holiday party 2 years earlier that I barely remembered attending, back before my marriage had even started to come apart. She had noticed me long before I ever noticed her, and she had waited 2 years to be close enough to do something about it, choosing a transfer to my team as the only version of that feeling she felt she was allowed to act on. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that the office no longer felt as empty as it used to, and that somewhere in the last few months, without any single moment I could point to as the beginning, I had started to need her there. There was one particular evening, maybe 5 months into the Denver Tower job, that I've held on to more than the others. It was well past 9, the kind of hour where the whole floor takes on a hush that feels almost sacred, and I was stuck on a connection detail that refused to make sense no matter how many times I redrew it. Harper rolled her chair over without being asked, looked at the sheet for maybe 30 seconds, and pointed at exactly the spot I'd been avoiding. "It's not the beam," she said. "It's the bracket underneath it. You're asking the beam to fix a problem that isn't its fault." She was right. And I remember laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, not because the joke was funny, but because something about being seen that clearly, that easily, by someone who wasn't trying to fix me, felt like relief I hadn't known I needed. We fixed the detail together, and neither of us mentioned that it was almost 10 o'clock, or that we were the only two left in an empty building. I would like to say the story stayed that gentle for the rest of the year, but that isn't what happened. About 2 months before that night at the desk, Ashgate's marketing needs on the Denver Tower project were handed to an outside agency called Halden Marketing Group, brought on to manage the public rollout for a building that had already started drawing attention from local press. I didn't think much of the announcement when it came through in an email. Agencies came and went on big projects like this one. I had no reason to expect that the name attached to the account on Halden's side, listed as the lead on the very first coordination call, would be Vanessa's. I sat through that first meeting with a kind of numb professionalism I didn't know I still had access to. She looked well. She looked like someone who had landed on her feet, which I told myself was good, was fine, was exactly what I wanted for her, even if the wanting came with an ache attached to it I hadn't expected. She was polished in the meeting, sharp about deliverables and timelines, and if anyone else in that room noticed the history between us, they were professional enough not to show it. I told myself this could work. 14 months is a long time. People move on. I believed that, for about 2 weeks. It was Harper who noticed first. Or maybe she'd noticed something I hadn't put words to yet. At a project mixer Halden hosted downtown, one of those loud rooftop events with a bar and too many name tags, I watched Vanessa pull Harper aside near the drink table for what looked, from across the room, like an ordinary conversation. It wasn't until later that night, walking Harper to her car, that I found out otherwise. Harper didn't want to tell me at first. When she finally did, her voice had gone flat in a way I hadn't heard from her before. She asked if I knew what I was getting into, Harper said. She said some things about your divorce. About money. I didn't know what to say to her. I asked what things, and Harper looked at me for a long moment before she answered, like she was deciding whether repeating it would make it more true. She said you walked away from the marriage reckless with money, that you weren't as steady as people thought. It wasn't true, not in the way Vanessa was implying it. There had been a difficult stretch, 6 months into the divorce, where I'd made some decisions about the condo we'd shared that I still second-guessed sometimes, decisions born out of wanting the whole thing over with faster than was probably wise. That was the truth Vanessa was bending. A real event, twisted just enough to look like something it wasn't, sharpened into something she could use. It didn't stay contained to that rooftop conversation. Within a week, I started catching pieces of it secondhand, a partner asking me, a little too carefully, whether everything was steady on my end after the divorce, a comment in a hallway that trailed off before it finished. Ashgate had a senior partner vote coming up in a matter of weeks, one I'd been quietly hoping to be part of after 9 years with the firm, and I understood exactly what kind of story, however small, however unfair, could quietly cost a person their seat at that table without anyone ever having to say why out loud. I didn't know, not for certain, that Vanessa was the source. I suspected it the way you suspect a draft is coming from a door you haven't checked yet, and in the middle of that suspicion, something else started happening that confused me even more. Harper went quiet. Not unkind, never that, but quieter than I'd seen her since she'd joined the team, more careful in what she said to me, slower to meet my eyes across the desk the way she used to without thinking. I read it as doubt. I assumed she'd heard enough of the same rumors I had, and that some part of her, reasonably, was reconsidering how much she trusted the man across the desk from her. I didn't ask her about it. I told myself I understood, and the understanding hurt more than the rumors themselves did. The night everything came apart was the night of the final structural submittal for Denver Tower, a deadline that landed at midnight and had emptied the 11th floor by 7. Harper and I stayed, because someone had to run the last set of checks before the drawings went out, and because by then neither of us needed a better reason than that to be near each other. Around 9, the elevator chimed, which it never did that late, and Vanessa walked out of it in her coat, heels loud against the quiet floor, a folder tucked under her arm. She said she needed my signature on a joint statement Halden wanted to release about the tower's public unveiling, language that framed the marketing rollout as equally credited to both firms in a way that wasn't accurate and wasn't fair to the engineers who'd spent a year on the actual structure. I told her I wasn't going to sign something misleading just to smooth her account numbers. Her voice changed when I said that, dropped into something colder and more familiar than the polished version I'd been dealing with in meetings for 2 months. She told me it would be a shame if more people at Ashgate heard the kind of things she'd already started telling a few of them. She said it like a fact, not a threat, which somehow made it worse. I told her to leave. She looked past me, at Harper, for just a second longer than was comfortable, something unreadable passing over her face. And then she turned and walked back to the elevator, without another word. The doors closed. The floor went quiet again, quieter than it had been all night, and it was just the two of us left standing in the lamplight with everything that had happened in the last 2 months hanging in the air between us, unspoken and impossible to ignore any longer. Those 2 months before that night had worn on me more than I let myself admit at the time. I kept replaying conversations from years earlier, trying to figure out which of my own decisions Vanessa might twist next, which private fact, from a marriage that was supposed to be over, might resurface dressed up as concern for the firm. I stopped bringing up the promotion with anyone, not because I'd stopped wanting it, but because wanting it out loud felt like handing her one more thing to aim at. I noticed myself pulling back from people generally, the same instinct that had sent me into an empty apartment every night, that first year after the divorce, and I hated how familiar that retreat felt, how easily my body remembered the shape of it. What I hadn't understood, standing there watching those elevator doors close, was that Harper's silence over those same 2 months had never been about doubting me at all. I had built a story in my head where the rumors had reached her and planted some quiet suspicion, and I had let that imagined story keep me at arm's length from the one person who had spent the better part of a year proving, in small yellow squares and shared coffee and 30-second fixes to problems I couldn't solve alone, exactly who she was. I would learn in the next few minutes how wrong that story had been, and how much of my own fear I had mistaken for someone else's doubt. Neither of us said anything for a while after the elevator doors closed. Harper stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the space where Vanessa had been standing, and I watched something shift across her face that I didn't have a name for yet. When she finally sat back down at the desk, she didn't pick up her pen. She just looked at me, and I understood somehow, before either of us said a word, that whatever came next was going to matter more than the drawings we still had to finish before midnight. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I don't think I can wait until I've figured out the right way to say it." Her voice was steady in a way that told me she'd been holding this for longer than tonight. "The reason I stay this late, it isn't only the work." I asked her what she meant, even though some part of me had already started to understand. "I stay because I want to be near you," she said. "I have wanted that for 2 years, since the holiday party, the one where you gave your coat to that woman from accounting because she was cold and didn't say a word about it to anyone afterward. I noticed you that night, before either of us knew who you'd end up married to, before any of this. I never said anything, because there was nothing to say back then, and then there was a marriage in the way, and then there was a divorce, and it never felt like the right time to make it about me." Her hands were shaking again, the way they'd been in the hook of this whole story, and I reached across the desk and took one of them in mine without thinking about it. "When I transferred to your team," she went on, "I told everyone it was because I wanted to learn from you. That part is true. I meant every word of it. But I asked for that transfer because it was the only way I could think of to be close to you without saying out loud what I actually wanted, which was just to be near you, in whatever shape that was allowed to take." I felt something in my chest that I didn't have a clean word for: relief, maybe, or the particular ache of understanding something a year too late. "The notes," I said. It wasn't really a question by the time it left my mouth. She almost smiled, even with the tears still on her face. The notes were me. I started leaving them because I didn't know how else to tell you I was paying attention, that I saw how hard that first year was for you even when you didn't say it. I told myself the sun doodle didn't count as a signature, that as long as I didn't sign my name, it wasn't really admitting anything. I know that's not much of a defense. I sat with that for a moment, turning over almost a year of mornings where I'd peeled a small yellow square off my monitor and felt, without knowing why, a little less alone than I had the day before. I've been looking forward to those notes for months, I told her. Longer than I let myself admit, if I'm honest. I know about the rumors, she said then, quieter. I've heard some of what Vanessa's been saying. I went quiet these last couple of weeks because I didn't know how to bring it up, without it sounding like I believed any of it, and I was scared that if I said the wrong thing you'd think I did. Her voice caught. I don't believe a word of it, Ezra. I know exactly who you are. I've watched you for almost a year now, closer than anyone else on that floor, and none of what she's saying matches the person I've seen. I could have let the last 2 months of doubt keep sitting between us. Some part of me, the part still bruised from watching one marriage fail, wanted to protect itself by staying careful, by waiting for more proof before I let any of this in. But I looked at her across that desk. At the 2 years she'd carried quietly, and the 11 months of small kindnesses she'd left where I'd find them, and I understood that the proof had been arriving every morning on a square of yellow paper, and I had simply been too slow to read it correctly. I believe you, I said. About all of it. The notes, the transfer, the reason you stayed tonight. I held her hand a little tighter. I'm not going to let anything Vanessa says undo what the last year actually was. We didn't finish the Denver Tower drawings until well after midnight that night, later than either of us had planned. But for the first time since the divorce, staying late in that building didn't feel like something I was doing to avoid an empty apartment. It felt like something I was choosing, on purpose, because of who was sitting 2 desks away. Before we packed up that night, she pulled one more square of yellow paper from her bag, the same kind she'd been leaving on my monitor for almost a year, and instead of sticking it to a screen, she handed it to me directly. I looked down and saw the small sun drawn in the corner, the same one I'd been looking for every morning without ever knowing whose hand had drawn it. Underneath it, in the same handwriting I'd finally learned to recognize, it said only 4 words. Now you know it's me. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket, and I remember thinking, walking out of that building with her that night, that I hadn't felt this steady in longer than a year. Vanessa's part in the story ended, in the end, not because of anything Harper or I did, but because of something on her own side of the table. About 2 weeks after that night, Halden's senior leadership discovered that the account lead on the Denver Tower campaign had a personal history with a lead engineer at the client firm, a conflict of interest she had never disclosed when she was assigned to the project. I heard about it secondhand. Through the same channels rumors had traveled 2 months earlier, except this time the story worked in my favor without me having to lift a finger. Vanessa was pulled off the account within the week. I don't know all the details of what happened to her professionally after that, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't feel the need to know. Whatever satisfaction I might once have wanted from watching her face consequences, it had already been replaced by something quieter, the simple relief of not having to brace myself every time an elevator chimed after hours. The Denver Tower project finished on schedule that autumn, 32 stories of steel and glass rising over a skyline I'd watched from the 12th floor windows all year. And when the senior partner vote came around a few weeks later, it went through cleanly. Whatever damage Vanessa had hoped to do with her half-truths never got the chance to take root. Buried under a year of finished drawings, and a project that had come in on time despite everything. I remember standing in the conference room the day they announced it, looking across the table at Harper, who was doing her best not to smile too openly in front of everyone else on the team, and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could easily measure, like the ground under me had stopped shifting. We didn't rush anything after that night, and I think that was exactly right for both of us. For a few weeks, we simply let the shape of things change slowly. She started leaving her coffee order on my desk instead of guessing at mine. We found ourselves walking to the parking garage together most evenings, without either of us suggesting it out loud, and one Friday in late September, almost without either of us deciding to make it official, we had dinner somewhere that wasn't the office kitchen for the first time. It felt less like the beginning of something new, and more like the honest naming of something that had already been quietly true for almost a year. A few of our coworkers noticed before we said anything, the way people always do. Someone left a joke sticky note of their own on the break room fridge a few weeks in a crude drawing of two stick figures under a badly drawn sun, with the words "Times we see you" 2 times scrawled underneath it. Harper laughed harder at that than I'd seen her laugh in months, and I found myself laughing right along with her, unbothered for once by the idea of being seen. 8 months passed, the way months do, when you're no longer counting the days until you can leave a building quickly, and then all at once. Denver had gone through a whole winter and come back around to autumn again. The same season we'd finished the tower project, the same slant of afternoon light through the 12th floor windows that had once made an exhausting year feel briefly bearable. Harper and I were no longer the last two people quietly avoiding an explanation for why we stayed late. We were simply together, in the plain, unremarkable way that a year earlier I hadn't believed I would ever be with anyone again. I started leaving the notes myself, somewhere in that 8 months, without either of us ever discussing whose turn it was. I'd catch her at her desk on a rough morning, a project running long or a client being difficult, and I'd find a scrap of yellow paper in my own desk drawer, the same small sun drawn in the corner, the handwriting different now, but the gesture exactly the same. She kept every one of them in a drawer at home, she told me once, right alongside the ones she'd been leaving for me the whole first year, as if the two stacks of paper together finally told the complete version of a story we'd both been living through separately for longer than either of us had let on. Some evenings we still stay past everyone else, not because either of us is avoiding an empty apartment anymore, but because the quiet of that 11th floor after 7 in the evening still belongs, in some small way, to us. The building empties out the same way it always did. The lamp still burns at the same desk. Only now there's no mystery left in who's sitting across from me, and no reason left to wonder why she stayed. Some nights I catch myself glancing at her desk the way I used to glance at my own monitor, half expecting to find something waiting for me there. And most nights, I do. I think about that first dinner sometimes, the one in late September, and how nervous we both were despite everything we'd already been through together. We'd spent a year sitting 2 desks apart, trusting each other with unfinished drawings and half-formed doubts, and the worst hours of a difficult year. And somehow none of that made it any easier to sit across a restaurant table and talk about ourselves as two people who were choosing this on purpose. Harper knocked over her water glass within the first 10 minutes and laughed so hard about it that the couple at the next table turned to look, and I remember thinking that I hadn't seen her laugh like that at the office. Not once. Not even on our best nights working side by side. It turned out there was a whole version of her I hadn't met yet, one that existed outside deadlines and drafting tables. And getting to know that version slowly, over that autumn and the winter that followed, felt like being handed something I hadn't known I was allowed to want again. Our coworkers adjusted to it the way people adjust to something that was never really a secret, more an open question everyone had been too polite to ask out loud. A few of them told me, once it was official, that they'd suspected something as far back as the spring, watching the two of us fall into that particular rhythm of shared coffee and quiet proofreading. I didn't mind the teasing. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't mind being known that clearly by the people around me anymore, after a year of trying so hard not to be seen at all. I used to think I'd be the kind of man who stayed late at an empty office for the rest of his career, quietly fine, quietly alone, having decided that was simply the shape the second half of my life was going to take. I was wrong about that, and I'm grateful every day that I was. I spent a whole year believing I was the only one still holding on to something, when in fact someone had been choosing to stay right alongside me the entire time, saying it the only way she felt she was allowed to, one small piece of yellow paper at a time. She never needed to say the words out loud, not at first. She wrote them instead, night after night, in handwriting I eventually learned by heart, and a small sun she drew without ever quite deciding to sign her name to it. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something because I think about it more than I probably should. Have you ever realized, maybe far too late, that someone had been quietly caring for you the whole time, and you simply hadn't been paying close enough attention to see it? And if you were in my position that night, sitting across from someone who had just told you the truth after months of silence, would you have had the courage to ask them why they really stayed? If this story meant something to you, I'd ask you to do 3 small things before you go. Leave a like, so more people find their way to stories like this one. Subscribe, so you don't miss whatever comes next. And leave a comment telling me what you thought of Harper, because I still think about that yellow sun more than I probably should, and I'd like to know I'm not the only one.